The sun had barely risen over the sprawling streets of Bel Air, casting a warm, golden glow across the sleek, multi-million-dollar homes nestled between lush palm trees. It was a picture-perfect morning in Los Angeles, the kind that made you believe everything in the world was in its right place. But beneath the surface of this affluent neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and luxury cars parked in driveways, something was about to unravel, something that would shatter the pristine veneer of the Reynolds family. Samantha Reynolds sat in front of her vanity, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The delicate touch of her fingers traced the curve of her cheek as she applied a final dab of foundation, a practiced motion from years of perfection. Her green eyes, once sparkling with the optimism of youth, now seemed weighed down by an unseen sorrow. At 33, Samantha was the embodiment of beauty, grace, and elegance, her long brown hair cascading over her shoulders in soft waves, her smile radiant and warm, the picture of the perfect wife and mother. Yet, despite all the outward trappings of a perfect life, she felt empty, disconnected, and increasingly isolated. Her husband, Marcus Reynolds, a successful businessman in the real estate world, had always been distant. Not in a cruel way, but in a way that spoke volumes about his priorities. Work, deals, and expansion were everything. The late-night calls, the endless meetings, and the business trips had left Samantha to fend for herself, in a house that was more of a cold, sprawling monument to wealth than a home. The space between them had grown insurmountable, the silence between them louder than any conversation they could have. Though he had provided her with everything money could buy, it was never enough to fill the void inside her. It had been months since Marcus had truly looked at her, much less listened to her. And so, she found herself seeking comfort in places she never thought she would, places that made her feel alive again. And it was there, in the unlikeliest of circumstances, that she met Dylan Bennett. Dylan was everything Marcus wasn't: spontaneous, creative, and attentive. A renowned makeup artist whose talents had graced the faces of the rich and famous, Dylan was the kind of man who made people feel seen. He wasn't just painting faces, he was creating connections. His laughter was infectious, his smile disarming. Samantha had first met him at a high society charity gala, where Dylan was hired to work his magic on the attendees. As soon as she stepped into the ballroom, his gaze had found hers, and in that brief moment, Samantha had felt something stir within her, a spark that had long been extinguished. They began working together often. Samantha, an active member of the social scene, would hire Dylan to do her makeup for various events. Over time, their professional relationship began to blur into something more personal. There was a warmth in Dylan's presence that made her feel special, cherished even. Each session was a subtle dance of compliments and shared stories, his gentle hands brushing against her skin in ways that Marcus had long forgotten how to do. Dylan made her feel like she mattered. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to enjoy it. Dylan was more than just a distraction, he became a lifeline. Their conversations, which once revolved around makeup techniques and fashion trends, deepened into talks about their fears, their insecurities, their dreams. She told him about the loneliness that had crept into her marriage, the emotional distance that had formed between her and Marcus. In return, he opened up about his own struggles, his past, his passion for his work, and the toll it had taken on his personal life. She learned that Dylan wasn't just the charming, easygoing artist he seemed. He was a man who, like her, was searching for something deeper, something real. But with each meeting, Samantha's feelings began to shift. What started as a harmless connection blossomed into something she could no longer ignore. She found herself eagerly anticipating their time together. The soft banter, the meaningful glances, and the way Dylan would always make sure to remind her of her beauty, these small gestures filled the void that Marcus had left in his absence. Yet, with every laugh and every tender touch, guilt began to eat away at her. She was married to Marcus, how could she betray him like this? The inner conflict tore her apart. Dylan was different from Marcus, but what did that mean? Was it just an escape from her reality, or was there something more to it? The questions swirled in her mind, leaving her restless at night, unable to find peace. As she sat in front of her mirror, looking at the woman who was both fulfilled and broken, Samantha felt a deep unease. It wasn't just the growing attraction to Dylan that unsettled her, it was the realization that she was no longer sure of who she was. She had become so focused on pleasing others, on keeping up the facade of the perfect wife, that she had forgotten to ask herself what she truly wanted. Her identity had become tied to Marcus's success, to the luxury that surrounded her, and yet she felt trapped. And then there was Dylan. His presence was a welcome disruption. He didn't care about her wealth or her status, he saw her for who she truly was, the woman beneath the polished surface. He didn't treat her like an accessory to his career or a symbol of his success. For the first time in a long while, Samantha felt like she mattered outside of her role as a wife. Dylan made her feel seen, cherished, and desired. But desire was dangerous. She knew it. Every time they met, the line between right and wrong became more and more blurred. She couldn't help herself. The connection between them was undeniable. And so, the tension began to rise. Samantha was walking a fine line, trapped in a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. The weight of her choices, of her desires, hung heavily on her heart. What Samantha didn't realize, as she brushed a final stroke of mascara onto her lashes that morning, was that the choices she was making were about to lead her down a path she couldn't return from. The delicate balance she had been living on, between loyalty and temptation, between a cold marriage and a passionate affair, was about to shatter, and nothing in her perfect, glittering world could prepare her for the consequences. The days passed in a blur for Samantha, each one like the last, structured, predictable, and devoid of the spark she had once had. Her life had become a series of routines, mornings spent in front of the mirror, afternoons hosting charity events or attending high society gatherings, evenings in the company of Marcus, who was always preoccupied with his work. But with Dylan, everything felt different. Each encounter, each stolen moment, carried the weight of something unspoken and untouchable. It was at one of these events that the line between professional and personal truly began to blur. Dylan had been hired for a glamorous gala, a charity ball that Samantha had organized. As always, he was scheduled to do her makeup for the evening, but this time, the tension was palpable between them. Their usual conversation was replaced by a charged silence, broken only by the soft sounds of makeup brushes swiping across her face. "Is everything all right, Samantha?" Dylan asked, his voice low, just above a whisper. She met his gaze through the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. She had been avoiding his eyes lately, afraid of what she might find in them, afraid of what might surface if she allowed herself to feel the depth of what was happening between them. "I don't know," she said softly, a trace of vulnerability in her voice that she hadn't intended to show. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Dylan's hand paused in midair, and for a moment, he simply watched her. The world around them seemed to disappear. He wasn't the charming, playful artist she had known. In that moment, he was the only person who truly seemed to understand her. "You don't have to have all the answers," Dylan replied gently, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was brief, but the spark between them ignited again, stronger than before. Samantha's heart raced as his fingers grazed her skin, sending a shiver through her. She forced herself to break the moment, to focus on her reflection rather than the whirlwind of emotions inside her. But it was too late, Dylan had already become a part of her, a part she could no longer ignore. As the evening progressed, Samantha found herself growing more and more restless. She couldn't concentrate on the conversations around her, the faces that smiled at her with hollow politeness. All she could think about was Dylan. She had never realized how much she had come to rely on him, how much he had come to mean to her until now. His presence was intoxicating, and she couldn't deny the longing that had started to fester in her chest. Later that night, in the quiet of her lavish home, Samantha sat by the window, gazing out at the city lights. She had become so entangled in the fabric of her own emotional turmoil that she no longer knew where she ended and the affair with Dylan began. The guilt gnawed at her, but so did the yearning, the desire to be seen, to be wanted, not as Marcus's wife, but as the woman she truly was. She thought of Marcus, asleep upstairs, oblivious to the cracks forming in their marriage. He had always been a good provider, a hard worker who had given her everything a woman could want, a beautiful home, a life of luxury. But he hadn't given her himself, not in the way she needed. The emotional distance had always been there, but now it felt like an unbridgeable chasm between them. She had tried to fill it with charity work, shopping sprees, dinner parties, but none of it worked. None of it mattered anymore. Dylan had become her escape, her sanctuary. But every time she allowed herself to believe in what they had, a rush of guilt would hit her like a cold wave. She was betraying her marriage, and that reality was inescapable. Yet, with every passing day, the pull of her relationship with Dylan grew stronger, impossible to ignore. The following week, Dylan invited her to his apartment for dinner. It was a small, eclectic place in downtown LA, filled with art and warmth. It felt like an extension of his soul, unpredictable, creative, and alive. Samantha had never seen anything like it. She felt like an outsider in this world of color and chaos, a world far removed from the sterile perfection of her Bel Air home. "I love this place," Samantha admitted as she looked around, taking in the paintings that adorned the walls, the mismatched furniture that somehow came together perfectly. It was everything her life with Marcus wasn't: raw, real, and free. "I knew you would," Dylan said, his voice soft but filled with a quiet pride. "I want you to feel at home here, Samantha." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. The weight of her situation pressed down on her like a vice. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between two worlds, between the man she had promised to love and the man who made her feel alive again. It was a battle she was losing, and she knew it. As dinner went on, the conversation drifted from casual topics to something more personal. They spoke of dreams, of what they wanted out of life, and what they had sacrificed along the way. It was the kind of conversation Samantha had longed to have with Marcus, someone who would listen, truly listen. But instead, she had found it in the most unexpected place. "Do you ever wonder if we're meant to be something more than just a moment?" Dylan asked, his gaze intense. Samantha looked away, suddenly aware of the tension between them, the unspoken weight of their connection. She didn't answer right away. She couldn't. The question lingered in the air, heavy and full of possibility. "I never thought I would ask myself that," Samantha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But yes, sometimes, I feel like I'm not meant to be here. I'm not meant to be the woman I've become." Dylan reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and comforting. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into it, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. She was tired of being strong, tired of holding up the facade of the perfect wife. "You don't have to be anything for anyone but yourself, Samantha," Dylan said, his voice filled with conviction. "You deserve more than this." The words hit her like a revelation. For the first time in a long while, Samantha allowed herself to believe them. She deserved more. She deserved to feel seen, to feel desired, to be more than just a role in someone else's life. As the evening wore on, and the tension between them reached a boiling point, Samantha knew deep down that she was at a crossroads. She couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. There were decisions to be made, decisions that would change the course of her life forever. But for now, she would stay in this moment, here with Dylan, where the world was a little bit more real, a little bit more honest. And, for just a while longer, she would let herself believe in the possibility of something more. The air in Los Angeles was thick with heat, the kind that lingered long into the evening, making every breath feel like a struggle. Samantha sat at the edge of her bed that night, staring out the window at the sparkling lights of the city. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, guilt, desire, confusion, each one fighting for dominance. She had reached the tipping point, and she knew it. The line between right and wrong had blurred into nothingness, and she was lost in the chaos of her own choices. Dylan had become an addiction, a dangerous one, but the rush of seeing him, of feeling alive in his presence, was something she couldn't shake. Her marriage to Marcus had slowly become a prison of isolation and unspoken words. Marcus, the successful businessman, the perfect provider, had never been able to fill the emotional gap that had formed between them. But Dylan made her feel seen, made her feel like she was more than just a beautiful housewife who had it all but was falling apart on the inside. Samantha had tried to talk herself out of it, to tell herself that she was just a woman yearning for connection, but deep down, she knew. She knew that what was happening between her and Dylan was more than just an affair. It was a reckoning, one that would alter the course of all their lives. That night, the phone rang in the quiet of the house. Samantha, still in her robe, picked it up without thinking, half expecting it to be Dylan. But when she saw the caller ID, her heart stopped. It was Marcus. He'd been out of town on business for the past few days, and she hadn't spoken to him much. Something about his voice, though, when it came through the receiver, sent a chill down her spine. Samantha, Marcus's voice was tight, sharp. "I need you to tell me the truth." She froze, the phone almost slipping from her grasp. A sudden wave of dread washed over her, and her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice cracking. She hadn't expected this. Not now. Not like this. Marcus didn't give her a chance to react. "I hired a private investigator, Samantha. I know. I know about you and Dylan." The world seemed to collapse around her, the air suffocating, the ground unsteady beneath her feet. The room spun, and for a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. "Samantha," Marcus continued, his voice now trembling with a mix of anger and pain, "you've been lying to me. I trusted you. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me?" The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she explain? How could she make him understand? She had made her choices, and now, they were coming home to roost. "I'm coming home tomorrow," Marcus said, his voice cold and final. "We need to talk." Samantha sat in stunned silence, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts she couldn't control. The house that had once felt so secure, so perfect, now felt like a prison. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. The following day felt like a dream, disorienting, suffocating, as if the world had shifted on its axis and she had been left behind. Marcus returned home earlier than expected, his presence like a storm in their otherwise peaceful home. Samantha had spent the night in a daze, unable to sleep, unable to face what was coming. She had spent the last few months hiding behind the facade of normalcy, but now the truth was out. And truth, like fire, burns everything in its path. When Marcus walked through the door, his eyes were cold, unreadable. He dropped his suitcase by the door without a word, then turned to face her. "Samantha," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I want the truth. Right now." Samantha opened her mouth, but no words came. Her body was frozen in place, her mind overwhelmed by the realization that everything she had tried to hide was now laid bare. She had known this moment would come, but she had never imagined it would feel this final. It was one thing to be caught in a lie, but another thing entirely to have everything you ever thought was real crumble in front of you. I'm sorry," Samantha whispered, her voice shaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Marcus stepped closer, his jaw tight. His gaze never wavered from hers. "You're sorry," he echoed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Sorry doesn't change anything, Samantha. You've shattered everything." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she fought to hold them back. She had never wanted this. She hadn't wanted to hurt him, hadn't wanted to destroy the life they had built. But now, standing before him, she realized there was no going back. The damage was done. Just then, the doorbell rang. A harsh, unexpected sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Marcus's eyes flickered toward the door, then back at her, confusion crossing his face. "I'll get it," Samantha muttered, her voice barely a whisper. She turned toward the door, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. When she opened it, she was greeted by a figure she had hoped never to see again. Dylan. He stood there, looking like a man who had come to confront his fate. His eyes locked with hers, filled with a mix of desperation and resolve. He wasn't supposed to be here, not now, not like this. But there he was, standing on the threshold of her shattered life. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind her, his eyes narrowing as he took in Dylan's presence. The two men locked eyes, Dylan, with his quiet defiance, and Marcus, with the cold rage of a man who had been betrayed. "What's this?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously calm. Samantha could feel the air in the room shift. The calm before the storm. The moment where everything would change. Dylan stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Marcus, we need to talk." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as she realized, with sickening clarity, that the storm was here. What had started as an innocent escape had turned into something far darker, and now there was no way to prevent the consequences. The damage was done. The silence in the room was suffocating, as if the weight of truth had settled on the shoulders of all three of them. Samantha stood frozen, her heart racing, caught between two worlds. Marcus's anger was palpable, the tension in his clenched fists evident. Dylan stood across from him, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something close to regret. The three of them, once so distant from one another, were now bound together by a chain of lies, betrayal, and the undeniable pull of an affair that had cost them everything. Marcus broke the silence first, his voice low but laced with a dangerous calm. "So, this is it? This is what you've been hiding from me?" He turned his gaze from Samantha to Dylan, his eyes narrowing. "You're the reason my wife has been," he stopped himself, shaking his head in disbelief. "What the hell were you thinking, Dylan?" Dylan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The man in front of him was furious, and rightfully so. Marcus's wrath was the culmination of months of secrets and broken promises, but it was more than that. It was the loss of trust, the disintegration of a marriage that had once seemed solid. Dylan felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he couldn't back away from it now. "Samantha," Marcus turned to her, his voice suddenly softer, almost pleading. "Why? Why did you do this?" Her eyes were filled with tears that she could no longer hold back. She had been living in this storm for far too long. Each glance at Marcus felt like a betrayal to him, but each moment with Dylan had been a fleeting escape, a brief reprieve from the overwhelming loneliness that had come to define her life. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, Marcus. I was just so lonely. And I thought I could feel alive again, but now everything's broken." Dylan took a step toward her, but Marcus immediately moved in front of Samantha, his protective instincts flaring. The anger in his eyes was raw, and Samantha saw for the first time the full extent of the pain she had caused him. He wasn't just angry, he was devastated. The betrayal had shattered him, and the sadness in his eyes made her heart ache with guilt. "You've been lying to me," Marcus continued, his voice thick with disbelief. "For how long, Samantha? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" "I didn't want to lie," she sobbed. "I wanted to feel like I mattered. Dylan, he made me feel alive. I never meant for it to go this far, I swear. But it did. And now we can't take it back. Dylan stood still, his face tight with emotion. He hadn't expected to be part of this confrontation. He had hoped, in his heart of hearts, that perhaps Marcus would understand, that he would see the desperation, the emotional chasm Samantha had been falling into. But he knew, deep down, that there was no justification for what had happened. He had crossed a line that he could never uncross. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Dylan said, his voice steady but regretful. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to come between you two. But this, it happened." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, nothing else was said. The silence between them was almost unbearable. But it was broken by Marcus, his face twisted with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I trusted you," Marcus spat at Dylan. "I trusted you, and you've betrayed me just as much as she has." Samantha's heart sank as she heard the words. There was no coming back from this. Everything was falling apart. Before anyone could say another word, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, unwelcome interruption. The three of them turned toward the door, but Samantha had a sinking feeling she knew what this was. When she opened the door, it wasn't just the police standing there. The officer's badge gleamed in the soft light of the hallway. His eyes were cold, professional, and his presence made Samantha's chest tighten. The moment of reckoning had arrived. There was no more hiding. "Samantha Reynolds?" the officer asked. "We need to speak with you." The officer stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze moving quickly to Marcus and then to Dylan. The tension in the room escalated, the air thick with impending doom. Marcus took a step back, his expression hardening. "What is this about?" he demanded. "What do you want with my wife?" The officer turned his attention to him. "We have reason to believe that a crime has occurred here. We're here to investigate the murder of Samantha Reynolds." The words hit Samantha like a punch to the gut. Her blood ran cold, and she felt her knees buckle beneath her. Her hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe, her mind racing to process the statement. Murder? What was happening? The officer's next words were a blur as he explained how the situation had escalated. The investigation had revealed more than anyone had anticipated. The police had found evidence of Dylan's involvement, though it was still unclear whether he had acted alone or if it was the result of a crime of passion. The entire neighborhood was buzzing with speculation, and the authorities were doing their best to piece together what had happened that night. The confrontation between Marcus, Samantha, and Dylan had been witnessed by several of their neighbors, and one of them had called the authorities. The police had responded quickly, and now, the evidence was stacking up against Dylan. Samantha could see it in the officers' eyes, they had their sights set on him. The unraveling of their lives had led to this moment, and nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus's face turned pale as the realization hit him. He turned to Samantha, his voice low and filled with rage. "This is your fault," he muttered. "You've brought all of this into our lives. Everything we built, gone." The words stung more than anything she had heard. Samantha wanted to argue, to defend herself, but there was no defense for what had happened. Her affair with Dylan had led them here, into a mess of lies, violence, and tragedy. Everything was broken. As the police continued their investigation, they quickly put the pieces together. Dylan was arrested and charged with the murder of Samantha Reynolds. The case went to trial, and the entire city watched as it unfolded, captivated by the scandal. The press covered every detail, sensationalizing the affair, the betrayal, and the tragic ending. The trial revealed the truth behind the tragic events. Dylan, overwhelmed by his feelings for Samantha, had become consumed by jealousy when he discovered that she had been contemplating ending their relationship. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, Dylan killed her. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Marcus was left to pick up the pieces of his broken life. The truth of his wife's betrayal haunted him, but the loss of her to violence left an even deeper scar. He would never recover from the heartbreak of her choices, but he had to find a way to move on, for his own sake, and for the sake of their children, who would forever carry the consequences of that fateful night. The trial had ended, and Los Angeles, like a city of millions, continued to pulse with life. The streets buzzed with the usual frenzy, the traffic never ceased, and the gossip about the scandal had slowly faded into the background of daily conversations. Yet, for those directly involved, the scars of that fateful night were anything but gone. The pieces of their lives, shattered by betrayal and violence, were scattered beyond repair, and no amount of time would fix what had been broken. Marcus Reynolds stood on the balcony of his home, looking out over the vast expanse of Bel Air. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the city, and for a moment, everything seemed peaceful. But the stillness was only temporary, an illusion that couldn't mask the truth. His marriage had ended, his family had crumbled, and the life he had worked so hard to build had been shattered. Samantha, his wife, the woman he had once trusted, was gone, and Dylan, the man who had taken her from him, would never be free again. The weight of the verdict had hit Marcus like a tidal wave. Dylan's conviction for second-degree murder had been swift, and his sentence was just as severe. Life in prison. There was no escape for him, no redemption. But for Marcus, the real punishment was the void left by Samantha's death. The woman he had loved, the woman who had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way, had taken a part of him with her. And now, he was left to pick up the pieces. He often wondered what went wrong. Where had he failed as a husband, as a man? He had provided her with everything, wealth, security, a beautiful home, but it hadn't been enough. Marcus had never realized just how lonely Samantha had become, how emotionally starved she was, until it was too late. He had been so caught up in his own ambitions, his own world of deals and money, that he had neglected the one thing that mattered most, his wife. The guilt weighed heavily on him, gnawing at him every day. He thought about their life together, the early years filled with love, laughter, and promises. They had been so happy then. But somewhere along the way, their connection had faded. The intimacy had been replaced by distance, the affection by cold indifference. Marcus had convinced himself that their love was strong enough to survive anything, but love, like all things, required maintenance. And he had neglected it. It wasn't just the affair that had destroyed them, it was the years of emotional neglect, of ignoring the cracks that had slowly formed between them. In the months that followed, Marcus had thrown himself into work. But no matter how many deals he closed or how much money he made, there was no escape from the haunting images of that night. He had seen Dylan's face, the anger, the madness, in the courtroom, and he could never erase the memory. But even worse was the emptiness left by Samantha's absence. The house felt so much bigger without her, and the silence was deafening. There were no more phone calls, no more shared moments, no more late-night talks. The house was a mausoleum of memories, and Marcus couldn't escape it. Marcus had thought about reaching out to their children, to find solace in their presence, but the truth was that their own pain was too much to bear. The tragedy had scarred them all, and they, like their father, were left to carry the burden of a broken family. For Dylan, life in prison was a punishment he could not have anticipated, even though deep down, he knew he deserved it. His relationship with Samantha had started with innocent flirtation, had escalated into something he had convinced himself was love, and then spiraled into madness. His feelings for her had become an obsession, blinding him to the reality of what was happening. What started as a deep emotional connection had turned into a dark need, and that need had driven him to do the unthinkable. Behind bars, Dylan spent his days reflecting on his choices, replaying the moment of that violent confrontation over and over in his mind. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't erase the sound of Samantha's last breath, the look of betrayal in her eyes as she realized how far gone he had become. He knew he had lost everything. There was no redemption for him. He could never undo what he had done, and he understood that. Every day in prison, he faced the consequences of his actions. The solitude was his punishment, the isolation a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed. But for those who had watched the trial, those who had followed the media frenzy and discussed the case over coffee or cocktails, the story was over. The court had delivered its judgment, and the headlines had faded. Samantha's death had become just another story in a long list of scandals and tragedies that people had grown numb to. The public moved on, as they always did, their interest quickly waning, but for the families involved, the pain would never subside. Marcus, in his quieter moments, reflected on what he had learned through this unbearable experience. He realized now that the things he had prioritized, the money, the status, the success, had meant nothing in the end. What mattered most was the love and the emotional connection he had taken for granted. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he moved forward. The love of family, of real connection, was something he would never again take for granted. In the years that followed, Marcus found a way to rebuild his life, though it would never be the same. He reconnected with his children, worked to forgive himself, and slowly began to understand that while some wounds would never fully heal, life had a way of moving forward, whether he was ready or not. As the dust settled and the aftermath of the tragedy unfolded, the question remained, how far would you go to feel loved? Was it worth it? Was it worth betraying everything for a moment of connection, a fleeting sense of being understood? Samantha had found her answer too late, and Dylan had sealed his fate with violence. But the real tragedy wasn't just the murder, the affair, or the betrayal. The real tragedy was that they had all lost sight of the one thing that mattered most, the human need for connection, honesty, and love. It was something they would never get back. What do you think about this story? Do you think the choices made by Samantha, Marcus, and Dylan were justified in any way? How far would you go to feel loved? Do you believe that love can survive betrayal, or is trust the most fragile element in a relationship? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your opinions on this emotional roller coaster of a story. What do you think the future holds for Marcus, and how could this tragedy have been avoided? Your feedback and ideas are important to us, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts.